I call this meeting to order. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro.
Welcome to the 27th meeting of the Standing Committee on Official Languages. Today, the committee is meeting for 2 hours for the study on government measures to protect and promote French in Quebec and in Canada.
Reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. À moins de circonstances exceptionnelles.
Unless in the case of exceptional circumstances, all virtual participants must use a headset with a microphone. And as you know, interpretation services are available, and at the bottom of your screen, you can choose Floor, English, or French. For many of our witnesses, if not all of our witnesses, you already are familiar with our committee and you know about the rules. But I would like to remind you of a few things. First of all, welcome to this meeting. Also, you will have 7.5 minutes for your opening remarks. That will be followed by a question period. I will use this card when you have 1 minute left, the yellow card. That also includes during the question round, and I will use the red card when time is up. I would like to officially welcome our witnesses for this afternoon. With us we have from the Ontario Francophone Assembly, Mr. Carole Jolin, President, accompanied by Peter Ominuk, who is Executive Director, and Brian Michaud, Policy Analyst. And from the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, we have Éric Forgues, Executive Director, and appearing as an individual, Rodrigue Landry, Professor Emeritus at the University of Moncton and former Director General of the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities. Without further ado, we will begin with the Ontario Francophone Assembly. You have 7.5 minutes for your speech. And I would assume that Mr. Jolin will be taking the floor. So you may go ahead and activate your microphone. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak as part of your study on government's measures to protect and promote French in Quebec and in Canada. As our national organization, the Federation of Acadian and Francophone Communities, wisely analyzes in its proposals document on the Government of Canada's commitment to protect and promote French throughout the country, the Government of Canada protects and promotes the French language mainly in 3 ways: by funding Francophone and Acadian community organizations and institutions, by transferring funds to the provinces and territories, for the teaching of French as a first and second language and the provision of services in French, and by funding official language learning in the public service. The last time I appeared before the committee, I addressed the issue of Ontario's chronic underfunding of official languages, so I will not come back to that today. Today, I will be focusing on federal transfers for French language education at the post-secondary level. As you know, there is a lack of Francophone professionals in many domains, including healthcare. There is a labor shortage in Ontario and across the country. Education is the oxygen of our community. As you know, the Franco-Ontarian community, particularly in Northern Ontario, has been in the throes of an institutional crisis since the February 1st announcement by the Laurentian University. Since then, about 40 professors in the French language programs have been fired in English. The position of International Student Recruitment Officer for French language programming, has been axed. French language programming has been bulldozed. In the process, bilingualism at Laurentian University has been obliterated. The universities of Sudbury and Hearst show a glimmer of hope for the sustainability of French language university programming in the North, but many questions arise. How did we get here? Is the money invested by the governments of Canada and Ontario really invested in French language programming and services? As it seems to be the case with part of the money for research or from donors, has it instead gone to debt payments or ongoing operations? Those answers I do not have. I doubt very much that the honourable members of this committee have these answers. I doubt very much that the governments have them either. Laurentian University, like other universities in minority settings, is not held accountable when it comes to official languages. Over the past 20 years, Laurentian University has not invested in us, Francophones. Since the year 2000, Laurentian University has created 26 English language programs. This year, those programs have enabled the institution to bring in 2,170 new students. On the French side, during the same period, only 5 new programs were created, bringing in 124 new students this year. On April 11th, according to data collected by the Francophone Professors Group of Laurentian University, the institution cut 45% of its French language programming compared to only 20% of English language programming. We are using the group's figures because it has been shown that data provided by Laurentian University are misleading. When it comes to accountability, why such a disproportionate cut to French language programs? And yet the governments of Canada and Ontario, as well as the French Language National Healthcare Training Consortium, invest over $12 million annually in Laurentian University to support it in providing high-quality French language programming. Where does this money go? We do not know. In March, our lawyers from Power Law Firm participated in a video conference with the comptroller at Laurentian University. We had filed a notice of motion in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. We were told that there were difficulties having showcase programs in French. But there was no decision-making power given to Francophones at Laurentian University. It would make you believe that Francophone programming did not receive any investments. We find it essential that there be more accountability in this type of budget envelope. We also believe it is essential that all federal and provincial funding for French language education and services, for example, the Official Languages Support Program for Education, be redirected as soon as possible from Laurentian University to the University of Sudbury. The Franco-Ontarians community's trust in Laurentian University is non-existent. Laurentian University no longer holds any legitimacy with the community it claims to serve. The Franco-Ontarian community is clear. The future of French language university programming in Northern Ontario lies with the University of Sudbury and University of Hearst, not Laurentian University, which must transfer its French language programs as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jolin. You've stuck to your time frame, so now we'll go immediately to Mr. Eric Fogg, Director General of the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, for the next 7.5 minutes. Please turn on your mic and begin. Thank you. I think the sound is okay. As you mentioned, I direct the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minority since 2012. Eric Landry did so from 2002 to 2012. It was created in 2002 thanks to funding from Canadian Heritage that was granted to the University of Moncton. Its mission is to do research that is relevant to support various stakeholders in official language minority groups and public policy artisans on linguistic matters. My presentation will be about the importance of research and data in formulating government action plans on official languages, the importance of engaging Francophone populations, and thirdly, to the necessity to refine Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. I'm not going to give you figures or analyses that demonstrate the fragility of Francophone communities. That's already been done. We know there's a slow decline, the vitality of French is weak in certain regions, and that their institutions are fragile. We know that there is an association environment that is working on a day-to-day basis to fight assimilation. What's missing, in my opinion, are public policies based on research. We lack true planning of official languages with objectives and clearly identified means and measurable results to be achieved. We must be able to measure the impact of government action and of Francophone stakeholders on the vitality of communities. We also need more transparency and accountability. Let's take the example of the Official Language Action Plan of 2018-2023. This provides for investments totaling $2.7 million for official languages. It says our new action plan will facilitate having measurable objectives based on probing data and the vitality of the communities. What are the measurable objectives in this plan? There are two that are presented. The measures of the action plan aim to stabilize the proportion of Francophones in this country to 4%, and they want to achieve 4.4% in immigration by 2023. That is insufficient, in my opinion, to know whether this investment of $2.7 million will have a true impact on these communities. We need other indicators. For example, the number of parents who can send their children to French school, the needs for school infrastructure, the use of French on social media, the consumption of Francophone cultural products, etc. But for youth and adults to live in French, you need a social environment and Francophone institutions. We need workspaces, educational institutions, daycare, sports, recreational activities, media, social media, and a public landscape that is Francophone. Have we analyzed the sociological environment of these communities? Have we supported these analyses and their intervention? Not to my knowledge. This is one of the limits of government intervention. It invests significant amounts on intervention, but there are no probative data. There's a community of researchers that could help the government in its intervention. We have great expertise in official languages. Several, including Rodrigue Landry, who's here with us, have led to greater comprehension of the factors that influence linguistic vitality in a community. The intervention of the federal government should engage the public in developing its plan of action and in all its government actions. The commitment of the population should be based on consultation, discussion regarding the needs and priorities of communities. That starts with communications. It's important for the Francophone players and the Canadian government inform the population of progress achieved. We are in the third year of the action plan for official languages. Where are we at today? We don't have any progress report. The government and Francophone organizations must make their actions and achievements better known. Efforts have to be made to get closer to the public, which is primarily concerned by these measures. When I talk about the population or the public, I'm talking about citizens, not just professionals of the francophonie. I think there's a danger in limiting consultations to organizations. By definition, an organization will always defend a viewpoint that's related to its very existence, its mission, and its objectives. There are objectives to consulting them because these organizations have developed expertise in their sector. This expertise should not be neglected, but there's been a tendency to neglect citizen expertise in the last few years. There's been a great deal of experimentation worldwide to have citizens take part in the democratic life of their country. There was an OECD report recently that talked about a deliberative wave. There are promising pathways that could be explored to engage Francophone and Francophile populations and to base ourselves on their collective intelligence. I think we have to encourage the creation of spaces to define communities and their priorities and to find ways to respond to these needs, and more broadly, to define a social project for the francophonie. I'll be brief here. One word on Part 7 of the Official Languages Act that directly involves communities. Part 7 forces the government to take positive action to promote the flourishing and development of minorities. It's essential to refine Part 7 to reduce the interpretation of this. The interpretation must be as broad as possible. As Michel Doucet, a lawyer, said, this part of the Act can remedy the situation and remedy the erosion of minority language communities. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fogg, who also respected his time limit. Now we'll go on to Mr. Rodrigue Landry, Professor Emeritus. So, Mr. Landry, you also have 7.5 minutes for your presentation. Please go ahead. Hello. Thank you very much. And this is about the Official Languages Act and the vitality of minorities. My short presentation is a quick overview of views that I have developed for a forthcoming publication. My presentation is in 3 parts. Part 1, the effects of the Official Languages Act on the vitality of minorities. Our research shows that contacts with the public administration are no different from other types of language contacts in the public sphere. These language contacts have no statistical relationship with the linguistic identity of individuals. Rather, they are related to subjective language vitality, that is, to people's perception of the status and vitality of a language in society. But this subjective vitality is only weakly related to the desire to be part of the minority community. Since public services in the federal sphere account for only a tiny fraction of language experiences in the public sphere, the Official Languages Act has little impact on the language development of individuals. We propose a first sociolinguistic principle concerning the potential effect of a language law on the vitality of a minority. A language policy or law has an impact on the vitality of a minority only insofar as it has a positive effect on the language and cultural socialization of its members. In our opinion, only Part 7 of the Official Languages Act seems to offer, at least implicitly, such a potential. We will come back to this. Part 2, the key players in the vitality of a language. Our theoretical models specify 3 essential and relatively autonomous actors whose roles affect the vitality of a linguistic minority: the community, the minority civil society, and the state or government. The first and most important actor is the community itself. Not in its very broad and impersonal sense, but through the individuals and families that constitute what researchers call the community of intimacy. The family is the basic unit. The family ensures the intergenerational transmission of language and provides the basis for people's identity. The civil society of the minority is the second essential actor. It manages the social organization of the minority. It exercises invaluable leadership in the creation and maintenance of the group's institutions, what is called its institutional completeness. Moreover, it is civil society that acts as an intermediary between the members of the minority and the state. The state, the third actor, supports the vitality of the linguistic minority by legitimizing its existence in society through policies of recognition, that is, individual and collective rights. The state ensures the delivery of programs and services in the language spoken and can fund vital institutions. Our second principle is, therefore, a language policy or law has an optimal effect on the vitality of a linguistic minority when it fosters the growth of the group's collective identity and coordinates a synergy of concerted actions by the three players essential to its vitality. The primary responsibility for coordination and synergy among the three vitality actors lies with the state. It is the legitimate policymaker and the holder of resources and power. It is the state that is best placed to implement an effective language planning program. Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. Part 7 of the OLA is collective and remedial in scope and aims at the substantive equality of the two official language communities. It is in Part 7 that the government's objective of minority vitality is based, particularly in Section 41. Note that in the wording of Section 41, the English version uses the terms enhancing the vitality, whereas the French version uses the terms favoriser l'épanouissement. From what I understand from the analyses of legal experts interpreting Part 7 of the Official Languages Act, there is still much to be done to clarify its purpose and scope. What does it mean to apply positive measures to enhance the vitality of minorities, support and assist their development, and foster the full recognition and use of both English and French in Canadian society? In my opinion, if these ambitious goals are not translated into concrete and real objectives for community vitality and into clear commitments and responsibilities for the government, the OLA may be important in appearance, given its symbolic nature for the country, but it will have no significant effect on the real equality of the two major language communities concerned. Revitalizing a language is an ambitious and complex project. A language cannot be revitalized without a true language development plan. This planning is based on an extensive and ongoing research program that guides the identification of priority objectives, the implementation of interventions to achieve them, and evaluations to verify their effectiveness. Paradoxically, since the 2005 amendment to the Official Languages Act that made Part 7 justiciable, the federal government's commitment to its 5-year plans seem to have regressed if we take the 2003-2008 5-year period as a reference point. The first action plan for official languages in 2003 had many of the elements of a true language planning plan. It was based on research and set real priority objectives tailored to each official language minority. The plans or roadmaps that followed seem to be the result of political compromises rather than a true language planning process. From a language revitalization perspective, in addition to a lack of clarity in the fundamental objective of the Official Languages Act and its Part 7, there are 3 major shortcomings that make it impossible to fulfill federal commitments. You have 15 seconds, sir.
For the vitality of minorities. 1, an absence of true language planning program. 2, the neglect of the main actor of the vitality of a language, which is the community itself, its individual members. And 3, the lack of intergovernmental coordination between the federal government and the provinces and territories. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Landry. I would also like to remind witnesses that if you wish to submit a brief to the clerk, we would greatly appreciate it. Now we will begin question period. We will have 2 rounds of questions today. A first round with the 6-minute, 5-minute, 2.5-minute, and then 5-minute time slots. And for the second round, we will repeat the same turns because the witnesses have agreed to be with us for 2 hours this afternoon. For the first 6 minutes, I will begin with Mr. Blaney, Vice Chair. The floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would also like to thank our eminent witnesses for their availability. This is an important study for the committee because we wish, I would dare to say, to expand the measures in the Official Languages Act and the definitions of minority communities in North America. So my first question will be for Mr. Landry. You conducted extremely interesting research and mentioned status, insecurity, and I would like to know, is this an opportunity in modernizing the OLA, dealing with our minority Francophone communities? And what would you say about the fact that French is declining in French? I would like your perspective on that. Yes, we did conduct research in Quebec, both in the Francophone and Anglophone communities. And here is what struck me. And this, for Francophones, dates back to the 1990s. And for Quebec's Anglophones, we did our last research in 2008 or 2009. And here's what hit me. For all Francophones in Quebec, there's no observable qualitative difference between a Francophone in Quebec and outside of Quebec. That is to say that when we look at their demographic profile and look at their vitality, when they are part of a majority rather, a strong majority, they behave as if they were a minority. So, or rather, given there is more protection for French in Quebec than elsewhere. I refer to the community aspect, families and individuals, and they behave as minorities when they are a majority, but also when they are a minority. Now, for Quebec Anglophones, we drew some conclusions, and we published 2 studies, one on the Francophones, one on the Anglophones. And lived experiences had an impact on subjective vitality. So the language in one's personal life, impact on identity, but they are the same factors that apply to both Francophones in Quebec as outside of Quebec. But what is different for Anglophones in Quebec is the following. For example, I don't see the Anglophone minority in Quebec as being a threat to French in Quebec. I see the threat to French in Quebec as being English outside of Quebec. it's on a global scale. And English, if it were a planet, would draw other languages into its orbit, to use that analogy. And even in Quebec, English has that pull. And still, Francophones in Quebec do behave in that way. Very interesting, Mr. Landry. It's as if you were telling us that, in fact, our Francophone minorities outside of Quebec are a double minority, and that Quebecers still behave like a minority, and that is somewhat what we notice on Montreal Island. But when it comes to Anglophones, even in a minority situation, there is a pull towards English, which is the majority language in North America. That's very interesting. I would like to add something. In the media, it is the most striking. So when research was conducted on Anglophones in Quebec, listening to English in the media was completely normal, even if they were in a minority setting. And even for Francophone minorities in Quebec, listen to English language media. Yes, like District 31, which will be in English this evening. I might not have enough time. I would like to ask you more questions, Mr. Landry. And I would like to ask the analyst, through Mr. Chair, to hold on to Mr. Landry's conclusions, because we will later be studying the Laurentian University situation. Thank you very much for your speech. I would like to come back to your recommendations. You used Laurentian University in English, even though your speech was in French. I think that's very telling. Mr. Blaney. Mr. Jolin, you will have time to come back to Mr. Blaney's question later, because there will be another full round. Now we will move on to Ms. Latanzio. And please do specify who your question is for. Ms. Latanzio, 6 minutes. My next two questions will be for Mr. Landry. And before I begin, Mr. Chair, I would like to ask Mr. Landry to send us a copy of his two articles that he mentioned in his response to my colleague. Here's my first question for him. Mr. Landry, what are the vitality factors for OLMCs and the different levels of government necessary to build an intergenerational basis for community transmission of language? I have written extensively on the subject, and it is early childhood learning for me that is essential. I've listened to a number of spokespeople and organizations, and Mr. Forgue has also written extensively about the interest that each different organization can defend. What is clear is that each body is asking for its share of the money. But if focus was really placed on early childhood learning, and after that on raising awareness, for example, helping parents to enroll their children in French language education, everyone would come out a winner. Because overall, the number is about 50%. According to Statistics Canada, it was only about 50% of the children who went to French language schools. That's why I would put the focus on this crucial area, which is early childhood learning and education. But there are many encouraging points in the recent white paper, which of course I read before finalizing my article. there are worthwhile parts, and it seems as though emphasis is placed on early childhood learning, if I understood the white paper. I also understood that you published a study regarding Anglophones in Quebec, which took place in 2008, 2009. Is that right? Yes, around that time. We have a more recent article which compares their behavior and how they behave in different situations. That study was very similar to one we had published on Francophones, and I think that was published in 2014. Could you also please share the 2008-2009 article and the 2014 one? Another question, Mr. Landry, could you speak to us about exogamous families and what that means for transmission of minority languages for children in those families, and trends for their school career and their linguistic trajectories? Yes, this is a subject that also greatly interests me. For example, when we look at enrollment in French language schools, about 34% of exogamous families send their children to those schools, compared to 84% if both parents are Francophone. But we have more sophisticated analyses that show us more about the direct impact when language is not transmitted to the child and when the child is not enrolled in a French language school. So exogamy is a factor that affects the family situation when it comes to language. And I like comparing exogamy to the federal government in that the family is a microcosm of a society. Children learn how to value two languages within one unit, as the federal government does. And for parents, this takes place within their own family. And I can see a role for the federal government to raise awareness among parents. All parents want bilingualism for their child. Very few parents really are aware of the issues. So there are what we call additive bilinguals who learn one language and then add the second. But it's always better when focus is placed on the weakest language. Thank you very much. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I would like to ask a question to Mr. Fork, if I have time. Mr. Fork, you mentioned Part 7 of the Official Languages Act. You said it was remedial in nature. Can you tell us, through Part 7, does the federal government provide institutional completeness for official languages? Well, there were a number of measures to respect Part 7. Through the history of the OLA, Part 7 is relatively young. And making federal commitment necessary when it comes to active measures, positive measures, is part of Part 7. More needs to be done. One of the problems with Part 7 is there was somewhat of a minimalistic interpretation by the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Forg. That is all the time that we have.
Let's go on to Mr. Beaulieu for the next 6 minutes. Thank you. I wish to thank our witnesses. All three were very interesting. I have a very general question. Haven't we started on a poor footing with the Official Languages Act 52 years ago by making the Francophone and Acadian communities equivalent to Anglophones in Quebec? For example, there was a study in 1996, if I remember correctly, that showed that most of the funding for schools for Francophones most of this funding went to Anglophone schools in Quebec, whereas these schools were overfunded compared to Francophone schools. So I think that that's what we're calling into question now. In recognizing there's a decline of French in Quebec, the federal government has a responsibility to protect French in Quebec. I'd like to know what you think about that. I don't know who the question was for, but perhaps I could start. We had legislation that defined two minority communities that did not correspond to what we imagined being Canada's language communities. We see Canada as a francophonie, which is in a more precarious, fragile state in the country. But that is not what was written into the Official Languages Act. And what the government is proposing here is as if we get back to something that's a little more faithful to the way we could perceive ourselves as Francophones in this country. For Francophones in Quebec, even Anglophones don't consider themselves a minority. That's a quite recent phenomenon for them. That wasn't part of their thinking. I'm talking about Anglophones in Quebec here. So that went against the current behind the Official Languages Act. The white paper seems to seek to get back to something that corresponds better to the actual political situation. That is, to consider all Francophones throughout the country as being in a minority situation. All right, very good. One other factor, what do you think of the fact that this will be the first study here at the Official Languages Committee where we'll be dealing with the situation of French in Quebec, the impact of federal linguistic policies on Quebec after 52 years? That means that this is related to the fact that the federal government only recognized the Anglophones as a minority when even the UN doesn't recognize Quebec Anglophones as a minority. They're part of the Canadian majority. And there was Bill 101 and the 1982 Constitution and so forth. I don't know whether Mr. Landry or Mr. Fogg have something to add. We wrote a book on graduates of French schools and another one on graduates of English schools. And with that analysis about the vitality incorporated in this study, I see two scenarios that are possible here. I'm not making predictions, but one possible scenario on the Francophone side is that with the help of the federal government, there could be progress when it comes to the legitimacy of language and the role of government. But at the same time, there are fewer and fewer people who go to these institutions and use the language. On the Anglophone side, our analysis comes up with one possible scenario where, because of the strong attraction of English, they have no problem using the language. But because of the fact that with Bill 101 in Quebec, there's a great deal of defense of the French language, they could lose control of their own institutions and the legitimacy of their language in Quebec. So these are two scenarios that go with the strengths of each. But, okay, what's interesting in this institutional completeness, this term you use, is used by Frédéric Lacroix. The more a minority situation has strong institutions, the more its language attraction will be strong. In Quebec, if you look at schools, there's very good funding for English schools. They get more students than there are Anglophones. At the post-secondary level, at CEGEP, it's almost twice as many. In universities, it's 3 times as many. So the federal government, with its positive measures, adds to this. I think it's about $50 million for English high schools, for CEGEPs and universities. It's a lot. What do you think of that? Should that be called into questions, that whole policy? I'm sorry, Mr. Beaulieu, that's all the time you have. So you'll have a chance to get back to that at the next turn. Now, for this next 6 minutes, we have Mr. Bouleris. You have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to get back to the first presentation made by the director of the Assembly of Francophones of Ontario. There's a drama happening here with the drastic cuts to French programs at Laurentian University. I still call it Université Laurentienne in French, not Laurentian University. I think my Conservative colleague noted it as well. You talk about bilingualism that was annihilated, loss of trust. Those are harsh words, but I do understand. Now, first of all, to you, is all hope lost in that institution? The trust has been broken? And is there any possibility of autonomy for the University of Sudbury that could take up those French language programs, especially the midwifery program, which is unique outside Quebec? Well, thank you for the question. You're quite right. The community has completely lost trust in the administration of Laurentian University. Things were not going that well in the past, as I mentioned. It hasn't been going well for 20 years. There was minimal effort to ensure that French language programming was improved, to offer more programs. According to our information, the marketing to recruit Francophone students did not come up to scratch. I didn't mention it in my presentation, or if I did, very briefly. Since 2002, the university had somebody on the English side that took care of international recruitment, and that allowed the university to get 350 to 450 international students every year. It was only 2 years ago that the university hired someone to promote the university to Francophones on the international scene. They got a little more than 100 students because of that effort, that attempt. And now we found out that that position has been cut because of the recent cutbacks. Now, to answer the second part of your question, the regents of the University of Sudbury voted to become the university governed by and for Francophones. We figure that this university has the charter necessary and the opportunity to ensure the sustainability of French language programming. It's essential that there be French programming. In the north, we see a reduction in options for young people in the region, in the province, and even other provinces who would like to come and study in French in Sudbury. By reducing programming in this way, the options for young people who want to study in French, and we know because of research that there's just a minority that will come to Ottawa or go up to Hearst. A minority will come to Toronto with the new programs there. Now, to do this, now they'll have to go to Anglophone universities. I always call this the highway to assimilation. The University of Sudbury is in a very good position to provide French language programming in the north for our students and to work together with the Université de l'Ontario Français in Toronto and the new independent university, because the University of Hearst improved its own charter last week. So we see a lot of opportunities and a lot of potential to better serve our students who graduate from our high schools. And that meets an urgent need. In the business community, for instance, they want young people who can speak both official languages to provide service. I'd like to have the opportunity to ask another question because 6 minutes go by fast. You're enthusiastic, and I understand your enthusiasm. We talked about the obligation to have strong institutions, be it cultural, educational, etc., to assure vitality for Francophone communities. I think this is a good example. But in your opinion, what should the role of the federal government be in this transition toward stronger Francophone universities in Sudbury and Hearst? Well, at both levels of government, first of all, the provincial government, we had many meetings about that. There is interest. Minister Mulroney talked about an interesting project, and Minister Romano set out conditions that are reasonable to achieve this. Now, when it comes to the federal government, Ms. Joly is encouraged and hopeful. She wants to provide a hand so that we can get a university in Sudbury that is totally independent for Francophones. I think there's a lot of work to be done between both levels of government, as was done in the case of l'Université de l'Ontario Français. Ms. Joly and Ms. Mulroney worked well together to put forward this agenda, and we're seeing the same thing when it comes to the University of Sudbury. We hope so. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Boulris. So now we will have 5 minutes with Mr. Dalton. Thank you very much. I thank the witnesses. It's very interesting. So in the white paper, the government talks about a committee of experts with a mandate to develop criteria to help communities with a strong Francophone community. I'm from BC. We certainly have regions with Francophone communities, and these days they are not clustered together geographically as they used to be. These populations are more scattered. For instance, in Vancouver, there's a Francophone community that used to be concentrated in Maillardville. There's still a Francophone community there, but now it's scattered all over. So the mandate of this committee is to deal with this issue. In your opinion, what should be the criteria to designate communities that have a strong Francophone presence outside of Quebec? Mr. Fogg or Mr. Landry, perhaps you could answer that question. I could begin, and Rodrigue, you could complete my answer. There was a change to the regulations. I don't remember the name of it exactly, but to determine regions where there's significant demand for the minority language services. We have a much more inclusive definition now. I don't have it committed to memory, but what I understand, I imagine that we want to continue to work in that direction. We want a very inclusive direction when it comes to offering services in both official languages. We have to have this active offer as broad as possible. What underlies this legislation is the idea that there must be a remedy of historic harm. The services have to be there to reverse asymmetrical tendencies. We have to be as generous as possible, as inclusive as possible in defining regions where there's significant demand that's deemed significant in the regulations.
Thank you, and Mr. Landry? Well, here I'd like to introduce a concept that I use in my research, the concept of socializing proximity. So, demographically speaking, and I quite understand British Columbia's situation, communities are small and dispersed. So in those situations, it is very difficult for parents, for example, to be tempted to live their life in French because their neighbors, everyone around them in their life do not speak French. So it takes people who are aware and engaged and committed to really send their children to French school and so forth, because the norm is to live in English. And the more a population is dispersed, or rather, let's say, the more concentrated a group is, the easier it is to live in French. When parents live near certain institutions, like a school, well, the closer the community is to the school, the more people will be drawn and will assemble around that school. And that is when we see parents enrolling their children in schools. So there are certain things that can be done. It is a demographic challenge. I'm going to ask another question if I have enough time left. So one of the problems that we've heard of, particularly when it comes to Francophone communities in British Columbia, is when there is an agreement for a strictly federal jurisdiction, and then the federal government decides to give powers to a third party. There is a question around how the policies will be enforced. Do you have any comment on the best way to remedy such a situation? In just 15 seconds. I think that is a question for a legal expert. I think that when a third party is hired, then the third party has the same obligations as the federal entity would have had. So there's not much we can do if things are not respected. Thank you very much, Mr. Landry. Thank you. The next 5 minutes to Mr. Lefebvre. Thank you, Chair, and good day, everyone. I am very pleased to be back on the committee. I'm in Sudbury right now. I'm less than 1 kilometer away from Laurentian University, mentioned by Carole. I could give a speech like my great friend Darrell Sanson. I only have a few seconds to ask a question. Mr. Jolin, you mentioned accountability, this whole question of accountability. And after years away from the committee, I can tell that this is a problem that remains. As you know, the federal government transfers funds to the provinces, and the provinces do not want to be held accountable to the federal government at all. And there's this question of how are provinces held accountable. I entirely agree with you, and I would like to ask you for some recommendations. We will be writing a report with recommendations. We will be speaking about universities in Canada, including Laurentian University. What would you suggest as solutions for accountability? Well, I think that 2 levels of government must communicate when it comes to Francophone minority communities to make sure that the money gets where it needs to go. I think it is very clear, especially when we look at the Laurentian University case here. One thing that we ask for between the 2 levels of government is for the amounts initially earmarked for the university, the Laurentian University, now be sent to Sudbury University, so that the Francophone community can have a school that is for and by Francophones, so students can come and study in the Sudbury area. I think accountability is all the more important for Francophone minority communities because there's always the question, will we really be getting what we have the right to receive? And these questions are getting louder and louder in Sudbury. Very good point. Earlier, you were also talking about recruitment of international students, and that job existed for 2 years. And one of my great friends actually worked in that, and I would like to acknowledge him. I am very close to Laurentian University. I taught a course there. My wife teaches at the School of Medicine. I'm in a terrible conflict because I'm so close to what is happening there. It is an extremely important institution. As Mr. Jolin said, what happened on April 12th broke trust, and we have to move forward and look for solutions. Some were presented by Mr. Jolin. And there's also a community group that is working with the University of Sudbury. When I was on this committee 2 years ago, we worked on one issue, and it was the enumeration of rights holders. Because there need to be positive measures. And since 2015, we have been trying to address many issues. So I have a question for Mr. Jolin. When it comes to Statistics Canada's enumeration of rights holders, what impacts can that have? I'm convinced that it does have impacts, but what impacts do you say that it has on communities? Well, we have to see the real numbers because at this time all we have are estimates, which are not representative of Francophone communities. So the number is 744,000 Franco-Ontarians, but I think that we are more numerous than that. I think that when people who are able to speak in French, we will have a much clearer portrait when those people are counted. In Ontario, there might be a great many more because in past censuses, the criteria were different. So I'm looking forward to seeing the numbers published. This will enable us to better plan when it comes to services we want to provide, when it comes to projects, including the University of Sudbury project. Thank you, Mr. Jolin and Mr. Lefebvre. We will now begin a 2.5-minute round, starting with Mr. Beaulieu. Perfect. Very quickly, I'd like to finish with my last question to Mr. Landry. The overfunding of Anglophone schools such as CEGEPs and universities in Quebec has an impact. What impacts do you think that has on the decline of French in Quebec? I cannot really answer that because I'm not aware of overfunding there. Those are not areas that I have studied personally. So I cannot speak to those. That's fine. If you had studied it, I'm sure you would have the same conclusions as we have. I'm sure you've seen some of the data. This brings me back to Mr. Jolin. I greatly appreciated your remarks. You spoke about the importance of having universities that are run for and by Francophones. You mentioned Sudbury University, Hearst University, or rather, yes, Hearst University. Should there not be efforts to encourage universities run for and by Francophones? What about funding for immersion schools? I think that that would be helpful. And shouldn't schools run for and by Francophones across Canada be prioritized? Well, I can speak to the Ontarian experience. Everywhere where Ontarians have taken their education matters into their hands, things have gone well, whether it be in high schools or in establishing colleges. We have 2 Francophone colleges. These institutions are doing very, very well, and there's no reason to think that things would go any differently in managing post-secondary institutions. So I think that should be done. Francophones need community, and we have a great example of how things go when matters are placed into the hands of citizens. When we see what happened with Laurentian universities, there we saw what happened with decision-making. Not too much power was given to Francophones so that Francophones didn't make too much of a splash. Thank you, Mr. Jolin, and thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Now, 2.5 minutes for Mr. Boulris. Please go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My next questions are for Mr. Forgues. You spoke of how important it is to base policies on numbers. I find that very interesting. You said in the current law, we have mention of verifiable measures, but which indicators do you have in mind specifically? What I noticed in the Minister Mélanie Joly's white paper also had to do with that. I think it's positive. But I'm sure Mr. Landry could also speak to this. There are a wide range of indicators we could explore. So when it comes to the way people practice language in their families, in their lives, and I don't think work is given enough attention either. When we look at the linguistic continuum of life, I think efforts should be made to see what can be done, even if there's no linguistic right recognized in the workplace or elsewhere. Look for ways to encourage language use. There are also indicators about institutes that exist. We know that we have the means and the resources we need to use them. Great. I met the Francophone School Board Association and spoke to us about stagnation when it comes to Francophone education programs and how difficult it is to retain young students. So primary schools are in competition because there are more sports programs and culture and field trips in English language primary schools. And even if there was an increase in enrollments in primary schools, those French student enrollments declined in high schools. Can you comment on this? Well, the Institute carried out a study and found that the English language side has a strong pull. So building educational infrastructure is important to retain French students. Thank you, Mr. Forgues. We have 2 5-minute periods left. The first goes to Mr. Godin. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the 3 organizations here today, Mr. Landry, Mr. Forgues, and the Ontario Francophone Assembly. I'd like to remind you that the study we're currently conducting is a study on government measures to protect and promote French in Quebec and in Canada. Mr. Jolin, I will start with you because my colleague, Mr. Lefebvre, spoke about accountability, and I found it very interesting. In your document, you placed much doubt on the relationship between the federal government and the provincial territorial governments when it comes to funding. Today, we are talking about Laurentian University. Laurentian University was probably motivated by a will to develop their institution and to keep their institution alive.
Their objective was not to protect and promote French, to my mind. That's not their mandate. Maybe it should be, but it isn't. I think the federal government has a responsibility, as does the provincial government, but each different organization has a different mission and objective. You mentioned this, or touched on it anyway. the fact that we give a precise mandate to organizations like yours to be the watchdog in a way, to make sure that money is used properly. Right now we're talking about Laurentian University, but if we look at the money invested by various levels of government in the past 20 years, there was no increase. Ms. Rizba of the Campus Saint-Jean came and told us this last week. There was no increase. So one has to understand that the managers of these institutions want to stay alive. They look at opportunities. Those who are entitled give money, but enrollment does also provide revenue. So the model of giving a mandate to an organization like yours for Ontario, and could be multiplied by the number of provinces where there's organizations like this throughout Canada, isn't that a possible solution? Well, you talked about the mandate of Laurentian University. Its mandate was to be a bilingual university. The most important point in all this, and that's part of our mandate, is the sustainability of the French language programming for the North. Our work is to protect francophonie, to protect our rights, and to work to support the situation of francophones in Ontario to get as many services as possible. Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Jolin, I understand your mandate, but you don't have power. You can't force anything. Couldn't you get a mandate by both levels of government to be the watchdog and make sure that public funds are maximized and be more effective? Yes, the university has a mandate, but it also has a right to survive in a world where there's competition. So, well, if the funding came with it, of course, that would be an interesting solution. Well, what is the solution? Well, for one thing, when it comes to accountability or funding, because when it comes to funding, well, Mr. Jolin, in terms of effectiveness, what is the solution to make sure that our institutions are there to stay, that they respect French, and that they protect it and promote it? Mr. Landry was saying so earlier. This happens during childhood, but it's throughout the learning process as well. So at the post-secondary level, it's as if there was some kind of blasé attitude. Well, first of all, transparency. The solution is to make the data public. Then nobody can presume or play around with the figures and cook the books. And that's the challenge. We know how universities are administered. We need to have all the data available, as is done in the business world, where you give shareholders all the data during an annual general meeting. In the educational sphere, I think these are public funds that fund these universities, and people have a right to know. Thank you, Mr. Jolin. Mr. Godin. We will now go on to 5 minutes with Mr. Arsenault. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the committee. Welcome again, because I think we've seen you before. Excellent testimony. We learn new things, even if we think that we're constantly surrounded by this persistence in advancing our linguistic communities. We learn something new all the time. I'd like to reiterate what Mr. Godin said. We want to study on the measures taken by the federal government to protect French in Canada and Quebec. We have to focus on this. But because we get into the modernization of the Official Languages Act, there are a lot of links in the chain. That means that we can promote linguistic duality. And one of the links in this chain, I hope I'm not wrong, is education. You have to read and understand your minority language. So my question is for Mr. Fogg. First of all, to your mind, the new census that will come up in 2021, about those who are entitled. My colleague wasn't able to follow up on his question. In your opinion, what will be the impact of this on the geographic portrait of our minority communities in Canada? And will that be positive or negative in its influence of our linguistic communities? We often do analyses for communities that need to know how many people they have who are entitled in their school district. We do this. We have limited resources. We don't have all the data needed to estimate these populations that meet the criteria of Section 23. We'll be now able to do that for the entire country according to different zones. We'll be able to respond to a need, and that will allow planners, those who have to make decisions, decide where we're going to build, renovate, expand schools. They'll really have a more accurate portrait of the number of people who are entitled to these services in the communities. Right now, we do it in a piecemeal way with limited resources and estimates. We saw in some cases that the number of people entitled was underestimated. A school was built for so many children who were entitled to this education, and then we realized soon after that there were far more. But now we'll be able to plan school infrastructure far better. We can do it throughout the country. I'm so eager to see these results. I think we'll have them in 2022. Do you have any kind of foretaste of what this could look like? What will the results of the census be? Perhaps I could answer that. StatsCan published a study in 2020 about their own questions in the new census, and they estimate that by counting the 3 criteria, or other than just mother tongue, there would be 56% more people entitled to services if we added these new questions. In some provinces, such as Saskatchewan, for instance, over 80% more. That's encouraging if there are more people entitled to these services. But the challenge is not just accounting for them, it's bringing these children into the schools. The post-census study in 2006 showed that it's often distance and lack of access to school. I only have 1 minute left. I'm still talking to you. Once we have those true figures, will you see negligence on the part of the community itself? Is that how we can solve these the problem? I wouldn't call it negligence on the part of the community, but we'll see that quite often, as Mr. Fogg said earlier, schools are built that are too small. It takes years to build a school, but in the meantime, parents take decisions that aren't the best, really. So at least now we'll be able to plan better. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Arsenault. You have 10 seconds left, but I think we'll start another complete turn. So the next 4 interventions will be 6 minutes. If members wish to share their time with their colleagues, please tell me. But I would start with Mr. Blaney. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is extremely interesting. Just to shed light on this for me and others, there's the theme of over-completeness. I don't know if Mr. Landry or Mr. Fogg could explain that concept, please. I could begin and Rodrigue could finish this answer. It's not a concept that I met or encountered in the literature, this over-completeness. It's either complete or it isn't. You can talk about completeness, having institutions in various sectors of life, but over-completeness, I really couldn't say. Mr. Landry? This is not a concept that I've heard about. I think that over-completeness in a minority situation is very, very rare. It's rather the opposite. Okay, I'm not erudite enough to define this term anyway. Mr. Jolin, you said there are solutions possible for francophones in Northern Ontario. You're working on that actively, and I congratulate you for that. But I'd like to give you the floor after I talk about the recommendations here. You said that it's important to have accountability. You said that the funds must be given to the University of Sudbury, redirected there, and a transfer of programs from Laurentian to Sudbury, these Francophone programs. Can you talk about the mechanics of this? I know we're going to discuss it in committee. The situation seems to be evolving. I'd like to hear you about this aspect because we understand that you burn bridges with Laurentian, but I'd like to hear your views on that. There's already been transfer work that's already been done. For instance, when Cité Collégiale arrived in Ottawa, there was Algonquin College that had French programming that was transferred over to Cité Collégiale. So I think we can use that model and rely on that to bring French language courses to the University of Sudbury. Of course, we'll need help from both levels of government to have the transition, not just of courses, but of teachers. There's an important infrastructure. Some of it already is in place. Some was brought forth by Francophone money. Now, do you hope to have this transition by the next academic year, by September 2021? Is that realistic, or do you have a timetable? Well, we asked, the request we made to the provincial government was to have a one-year period to get the time to do things right. Okay, thank you. My last question, and I'd like to open it up to everyone. There's a lot of talk about institutions, and maybe there's a difference here. I'm a Quebecer. We in Quebec have the state, which is a strong institution that we can rely on, whereas in a minority situation, institutions are extremely important, such as schools and university. I'd like to open up the floor on that and hear your views about the importance of institutions in minority situations and how the new legislation with new broader definitions will contribute to this vitality. If I understand correctly, and I'll close with this, you really need an asymmetrical view of official languages where French in Quebec or elsewhere has a dominated language status compared to English. Well, with the concept of asymmetry, if we properly analyze the situation of people, there's not necessarily a symmetry. It's just we give everybody what they need. When it comes to institutions, I distinguish two major types. Some I call institutions of solidarity, those that feed the identity of individuals. So early childhood, daycare, schools, post-secondary, media are part of that, and even the workplace in some respects. These are living environments, and it's by living that we develop our identity. The second category is what I'd call status institutions. For example,
health services take place in the public sphere, but those are not places where one develops a linguistic identity. Subjective identity has a certain importance because to use a language, one has to believe that the language is worth speaking, and that's part of subjective identity. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. We will now move on to Ms. Martinez-Ferrada for the next 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us this evening. I found your remarks fascinating, and I think I will take a lot away from them. I would like to speak to you about immigration. We haven't heard much on it, but I think it's a very important topic. We have heard from witnesses, and in their opinion, one of the vital criteria for the French language is immigration. It is a driver of population growth, and the vast majority of immigrants have neither English or French as a mother tongue. So what recommendations can you give regarding immigration to improve the demographic situation across the country? And what impacts do you see from immigration policies across the country? I'm not sure who would like to begin. I can begin. Go ahead, Mr. Landry. Well, I'm not an immigration expert, but when birth rate in families no longer gives the number of children that are needed to replace the prior generation, we must rely on immigration. In the white paper, there was mention of a 4% immigration target for francophones. I think we should follow in the footsteps of the NHL. When one team loses all the time, they have the first choice for drafting. So to maintain equality, we can't give first choice to the Stanley Cup winners. First choice has to go to the team at the bottom of the list, and it's much the same for immigration. When it is difficult to recruit people, and there are all sorts of numbers on francophones, and we know that those who speak mostly French will go to Quebec. But I think we should aim higher for minorities. Thank you, Mr. Landry. For minority language communities, integration is very important when it comes to immigration. Could you further comment on that? Mr. Jolin, perhaps, when it comes to integrating immigrants in minority language communities? If I may, through the FCFA, a lot of work is done regarding immigration when it comes to welcoming new arrivals into our communities. We, through the Welcoming Communities, we launched that initiative a few years ago. And the goal of that program, or rather the goal is to well establish that program, to develop a structure that will help those individuals. We know that a large share of Francophone immigrants go to Ontario, especially Toronto. And there are a number of organizations there to foster their welcome, and that welcome starts at the airport. So since November, there has been a kiosk at Pearson Airport that welcomes people and that guides them, directs them towards communities and helps them to get to know the Francophone community. So I think we're on the right track. Do you think the government can do more when it comes to those welcoming and integration structures in Quebec, but also in communities that want to have a strong Francophone linguistic vitality, and that they want tools for that? Do you think more can be done? Well, yes, more can always be done. There are 3 welcoming communities in Ontario that were part of the program. So could we stretch that program to other communities? Certainly. And what does that program do? What are the impacts? Well, I think that it's been talked about around the world. And I think it brings in more immigration for us because people feel that they will be welcomed warmly and that afterwards they will be able to actively participate in community life. And when it comes to those communities that you mentioned, are you talking about Francophone immigration only? How would you describe it? I don't remember actually how those communities were chosen, but it's Hamilton, Hawkesbury, and Sudbury in Ontario. Those are the three communities. They don't have millions of residents, but the idea was to draw immigrants so that they could get to know more cities than just Toronto. And do you think immigration is linked to economy? For example, tourism. For example, if we brought in more Francophone immigrants to those communities? Yes, that is very interesting. And we could talk about other economic situations. There are economic needs when it comes to positive impacts for the entire infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Jolin and Ms. Martinez-Ferrada. Now we will move on to Mr. Beaulieu for 6 minutes, please. Thank you. Mr. Landry, I think that you understood your term surcomplétude. It's overfunding. Overfunding, for example, in English language post-secondary education and in Quebec. And you said that there was no overfunding for minority communities. But that's not true for Quebec, because for Anglophones in Quebec, there really is overfunding. For example, 45% of healthcare jobs in Montreal are in the English network, although Anglophones only make up 17% of the population of Montreal, which is very interesting. On the other hand, I'd like to know what you think of the following. Common language is at the basis of Quebec's language policy. So for new arrivals who establish themselves in Montreal, we can compare them to those who establish themselves outside of Montreal. Allophones or English speakers go elsewhere than Quebec in Canada. I think that action needs to be taken in this area. So if French really were the common language in Montreal, I think we would have seen an increase in linguistic transfers towards French. If we could make French the common language, we would probably be able to fight the decline of French. But I want your opinion. If outside of Quebec, in regions where there's a critical mass of francophones, in federal institutions, if we made French the common language, do you think that could be part of the solution? Well, outside of Quebec, I think that would be something difficult to legislate to begin with. Bill 101 in Quebec is well-known world-round. The three groups that succeeded the best were Hebrew, and then the Catalans, and then the Quebecers, who succeeded best at defending their minority language. So the idea of a common language is very logical, in my opinion. I think it's Section 59 not to recognize the mother tongue to become a rights holder for schooling. And in that criterion alone, we can see that there are many francophones who would prefer to send their child to school in English. And I would call this social naivete in parents, because parents believe that the best program, the best way to have bilingualism is to split languages 50-50. That is dual immersion, and Spanish people study 50% their language and 50% in English, and that is a very good program. But if you applied that same program in a minority setting, the result would not at all be the same. So Yes, I believe that common language is a very good concept for Quebec to protect its language. In North America as a whole, there's a very low rate of francophones, so Quebec must defend itself. Mr. Beaulieu, that's right. So there is a fight. The federal government pushes for institutional bilingualism and more services in English, fighting against the Quebec government. So this must be looked at one time or another. I think that Quebecers and Acadian and other Francophone communities in Canada should unite. And I think there has been a divisive effect because the OLA, the Official Languages Act, means that Anglophones represent Quebec as the minority in Quebec. I think we should include Quebec advocacy, Francophone advocacy groups as well to participate in the conversation, and this would lead to more solidarity. I think Quebec Francophones have an important role to play to defend Acadian and Francophone communities everywhere in Canada. What do you think? Well, I see we don't have much time left, but I think there are two major societal cultures in Canada, and I like this concept, and this has led to the two official languages. So we can see that Francophones outside of Quebec share the same societal culture as Quebec, and the minority Anglophones in Quebec or rather, I probably don't have the time to explain it, but there's a concept of cultural autonomy. So New Brunswick is probably the best example of that, and it has to do with the concept of individuality, where institutions participate, and the more we can do that, the better it is for minorities. Thank you both. For the next 6 minutes, Mr. Boulris will have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In a former life, I worked for the FTQ union in Quebec, and it put a lot of focus on French in the workplace. We were very pleased with that. And later, with the NDP, we have always pushed so that the Charter of the French language also be enforced in a telecommunication, different transport organizations, which did not happen under federal jurisdiction. But we have seen some openness to this, where linguistic rights of workers can be protected if they wish to work in French or communicate with their employer in French. So that's a step in the right direction. We have been pushing for this for years. And the reform document also mentions private and companies under federal jurisdiction outside of Quebec. And it's not clear yet, but it mentions regions where there is a strong presence of Francophones or minority linguistic communities. And one of the witnesses started mentioning working language. How do you see this step forward? And what is the importance of the workplace in the prosperity and survival of language in a given region?
I was glad to see this in the white paper, taking into account linguistic regimes of the provinces, so harmonizing the federal linguistic regime with those that exist in the provinces. That would be the case for Quebec, for instance, and mean that federal institutions would be subject or would comply with the spirit of Bill 101. And we'd have the equivalent in other provinces. When it comes to the language of work, as can be observed, and I don't have the figures here, but we could come up with them if necessary, even in Quebec, there's some anglicization in the workplace, and I think that that may contribute to correct the situation if we want to have Francophone spaces in workplaces, because that's one of the vectors of assimilation. There are many Francophones that work in English, and that can have an impact on the vitality of communities, in all communities. So I think we have less room to maneuver in workspaces, but where we have a possibility for intervention, we should do so. So I salute that kind of initiative. Okay, well, let me put a question to Mr. Fogg, and then I'll open it up to the other two guests or witnesses. We haven't yet talked about the role of Radio Canada for Francophone groups in minority situations. Is that a conscious forgetfulness because the environment has changed because of new technology? Or should we still count a great deal on regional news in French to talk about Francophone communities outside Quebec? What is the role of this public broadcaster, according to you, Mr. Fogg, and maybe you, Mr. Landry? Well, I'm no expert on media, but that does play an important role. The media environment is completely being transformed because of digitalization. We have to see what that will mean and how the francophonie is positioned in this environment. That includes social media that is also under transformation. So we have to catch up. It's present in the white paper. They talk about it. They are aware of it. Mélanie Joly talked about the digital world. It's important for Francophones to position themselves properly in the governance of this media. One of Mr. Landry's students, Sylvain Saint-Onge, wrote a thesis. He was interested in social media and the youth, because youth spend a lot of time on social media. It's a very important space for socialization for them. And it would be necessary to measure the impact this had. And what language do they navigate social media? In what language do they communicate? Okay, thank you, Mr. Fogg. Thank you. I'm sorry, because the bells are ringing. The bells are ringing indeed. So we have to make a decision. I need unanimous consent by all members. We have about 15 minutes left. We have one last turn that we could have. And given that the bells ring for half an hour, I need unanimous consent in order to finish Mr. Boulris's questions. He has 1 minute left, and spend the next 15 minutes and then close and go vote. So I see a few signals here, so let's do it in the opposite way. Is there any objection to continuing for another 15 minutes? Seeing none. So thank you. We will continue with our witnesses. Mr. Boulris, you have 1 minute left for your intervention. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I simply wanted to say, Mr. Fogg, I have teenagers. I can tell you they spend a lot of time on social media. It would be nice to have a picture of the influence this has on language and linguistic usage throughout society. Well, I'd like to get back to Mr. Landry in the language of work. What is your vision of the importance of French at work? It's very important. As I said a bit earlier, work is not just an institution, it's a living environment. It influences everything you do. I didn't do a lot of study on the workspace, but I did do a study for the federal government to see in what language public servants wanted training. I analyzed their networks, their vitality, where they came from. It's incredible how public servants themselves wanted their training in English because they said in any event, we work mostly in English. I want the right vocabulary. we end up denigrating our own language in order to succeed better in the public service. Thank you, Mr. Landry. Thank you very much. We will now go on to Mr. Williamson for 5 minutes. Mr. Williamson. Yes, hello. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Landry, you talked about New Brunswick and their system of duality. Can you explain why you think this works in New Brunswick and how it could improve the situation of minority communities elsewhere in Canada? Well, to my mind, I discuss this as an example of cultural autonomy. Cultural autonomy doesn't mean separation. It means being able to take care of your own business. So cultural autonomy and the system of duality in New Brunswick means that both communities are autonomous. They manage their own institutions. Now, I don't think we can expect a population with 5% francophones could have the same kind of duality as New Brunswick, where about 70%, 74% live in communities where there's a majority of francophones. So that's a factor that facilitates things in New Brunswick. But to my mind, the concept itself remains a good one. It's been demonstrated many, many times that bilingual institutions do not work. For example, one can imagine in 1963 when the University of Moncton was created, if we'd followed the model of the University of Ottawa, a bilingual institution, University of Moncton would not have contributed as it did to the minority as it has done. That's why I really don't believe in bilingual systems. Cultural autonomy is something that has to be adapted to the vitality of each community, but to my mind, that's the solution. Yes, I completely agree. We have a university in Fredericton, which is totally Anglophone, and Moncton works very well today because their priority is French. Mr. Fork, do you have any comments about duality in New Brunswick and how it could help us elsewhere in Canada? Well, my comments would join up with those by Rodrigue Landry. If we can have our own institutions for a given linguistic group, the better. We have living spaces that are francophone. That's what we have to get. The more there are these living spaces in French, more individuals will have opportunities to evolve in their own language. Otherwise, they're condemned to adopting the language of the majority. So that's what I'd say that would tend to agree. Yes, I found that. I did my BA at McGill in Montreal, an Anglophone university. Right next door, we had UQAM and other French universities. The Anglophones that went to UQAM spoke much better French than I do, and the same with the Francophones that went to McGill. They're much more bilingual. But we see how that happens for both communities. So, Mr. Chairman, that's all for me. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Williamson. Well, now I will give the floor for the next 5 minutes to Mr. Duguid. Terry Duguid, the floor is yours.
To our witnesses, I'll be sharing my time with Mr. Arsenault. Just one question for Mr. Landry. I think it goes to, I'm from Manitoba in Western Canada, and it's interesting. Even within Western Canada, you see regional differences with regard to the decline of French in Alberta and the Northern Territories. It appears to be increasing, and in some cases very rapidly in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, declining. And as you know, in Manitoba, we have a very tight and geographically focused community in St. Boniface and some of our southern Manitoba communities. I wonder if you could maybe reflect on and give us some picture of what's going on in Western Canada with respect to the vitality of French, and perhaps you could use your framework of the three actors: community, family, civil society, government. And if we understand what the problem is, hopefully we can develop solutions. Mr. Land.
Well, in Western Canada, the problem generally, I mean, there's maybe a few exceptions, but generally is that the problem is dispersion of small communities. Like I remember testing in Saskatchewan and traveling for 3 days just to go test about 7 or 8 students in each school. And Saskatchewan is a good example of dispersion. So what's missing there is for the first actors, the parents and the families, is that they don't have social proximity to institutions, to other francophones, and so on. So it's a major challenge on that side. So, and this, then you have to try to, the second component is the institutional completeness, and that's also dictated by numbers. So, and then also the third factor is the state with the legitimizing the legitimacy of the language. So in that case, I think governments could be more generous in legitimizing the language and giving them access to communities. I've testified a few times in court cases in Western Canada, and the thing is that they build small schools and they quickly overgrow the schools, and then so it's like there's a lack of vision. You might remember the last court case in BC that went to the Supreme Court. The judge herself says, well, it's true that we don't give the Francophones what they need, but they're going to assimilate just the same. So we should not invest too much. With those kind of attitudes, we have problems.
Mr. Arsenault.
Merci, Monsieur Duguid. Pour finir ma question.
Thank you, Mr. Duguid. Earlier, I was talking about the census and people who are entitled to services. Could you answer yes or no, Mr. Fogg, Monsieur Landry? Is this initiative by the federal government a positive way to do things? Is it a measure that will protect these communities in Canada? Well, I'd say that it's a measure that will give us an accurate portrait of the situation. As I said earlier, it's not because we have more people entitled. If children don't go to French schools, the percentage of school attendance in French will go down. Thank you, Mr. Landry. Mr. Landry or Mr. Fogg, earlier you talked about the community bases for intergenerational transmission of the language. What are the factors of vitality that we have to insist upon, and what could different levels of government do? Well, I'd say that there's a need. We have an action plan on official languages, but we have no communication plan with the main actor, that is parents. I mentioned this in my presentation earlier. One of the factors is that we neglect the main actor here. If the federal government could inform parents, and there's research being done right now that is incontrovertible, when you emphasize language that is weaker, children become bilingual. If you educate 80% of children in French and they succeed in English as well as Anglophones, they're the best bilingual people. It's to inform parents. Thank you, Mr. Landry. Thank you, Mr. Arsenault. Well, look, I want to respect our timetable. I'll give 2 minutes to Mr. Beaulieu, 2 to Mr. Boulris, because we have 17 minutes left. The bells continue ringing.
So, Mr. Beaulieu, for 2 minutes. Perfect. Well, on the one hand, yesterday we saw Radio-Canada writing about the complaints by Mr. Taclé, he sends in 1,000 complaints per year. And there was mention that 40% of federal public servants do not feel comfortable working in French in designated bilingual regions. So the official languages commissioner said that the modernization of the OLA would hold more weight. Why does the federal government not favor bilingualism in its own institutions, where the federal government is the boss? Well, I think it's a challenge to change an institutional culture. When English is the majority language, there are dynamics that form. It's very difficult to overturn them and difficult to give French equal footing as French. To do that, I think time and resources must be invested to establish an institutional culture that gives equal status to both languages. I don't think as many measures as could have been taken have been taken. Do you think this shows a lack of will because the Official Languages Act has existed for 50 years? Even Francophone federal public servants in Quebec say that they have difficulty working in French and mentioned systemic discrimination. The problem is the language to use is the language of one's choice. But if the region is a majority French region, French should be the language used. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. We do not have much time left, so 2 minutes now go to Mr. Boulris, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to come back to immigration. Ms. Martinez-Ferrada raised this matter earlier. To reach the 4% target, for years in Quebec, the Quebec government has itself been choosing economic immigrants, which make up most immigrants, and they base it on factors such as whether the immigrant speaks French. What would be the best tool for provinces, including New Brunswick or Manitoba, so that the provinces would be able to have that option too, so they can choose immigrants based on whether or not those immigrants speak French to strengthen the minority language setting? Mr. Landry, or the first person who wants to take the mic. Mr. Landry, I think that first there's a problem with immigration. I think it's already been mentioned, and that is that there's always the risk that immigrants will go towards major centers, and it's always in major centers that assimilation is strongest. Now, there's an expectation that immigrants who establish themselves in French in a Francophone setting will be less vulnerable to assimilation. But I would like to come back to the importance of properly integrating immigrants. I believe that if we allowed more immigrants to go places where Francophonie is already relatively strong, that would be favorable because they can't go to big centers. That's where assimilation is strongest. Thank you. Mr. Boulris, you have only 10 seconds left. Well, we'll have a good vote, everyone. Thank you. I will stop things there. And I would like to thank you, witnesses, for participating in this study we are conducting. It is very interesting. And I would like to remind you, you can also send us your briefs. Send those into the clerk. In closing, I would like to thank the representatives from the Ontario Francophone Assembly, the President, Mr. Carole Jolin, the Executive Director, Peter Homenuk, and the Policy Analyst, Mr. Brian Michaud. I would also like to thank Mr. Éric Forgues, the Executive Director of the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities. And also, as an individual, thank you, Rodrigue Landry, Professor Emeritus at the University of Moncton and former Director General of the CIRLM. A big thank you on behalf of the committee and on behalf of myself. I would also like to acknowledge the clerk, analysts, and the entire team, and I wish everyone a good vote, and the meeting is adjourned.